Chapter 12, Services, Key Issue 4. Why do services cluster in settlements? Quick review. Activate prior knowledge. I can statements. 1. Describe the difference between clustered and dispersed rural settlements. 2. Explain the type of services in early settlements. 3. Identify important prehistoric, ancient, and medieval urban settlements. 4. Explain the two dimensions of urbanization. 5. Analyze how clustered services define the difficulty in defining urban areas. 6. Compare and contrast meets and bounds settlements with long lot settlements. 7. Describe how the clustering of services increases urban development. Services in rural areas. Services in rural areas can come in two forms. Either it's a clustered settlement or it's a dispersed settlement. Usually a clustered settlement is an agricultural-based community. When we look at the importance of the communities between families that live close proximity with a collection of farming houses, oftentimes you'll see homes, barns, tool sheds, consumer services, religious structures, and right next to it, schools. This is the most numerous globally currently in the world. The other is dispersed rural settlement. This is individual farms. Typical of North American rural landscape. This is typical from the not the New England area, but from the middle colonies during colonial America, where middle colonies were assortments of individuals rather than groups of a cohesive group like the New England colonies. We look at the von Thunen's model. It's very similar. So you have concentric rings. When we look at the Krull village is pastoral nomads in sub-Saharan Africa. They're known as the Maasai people. The Krull villages have enclosures for livestock in the center, surrounded by a ring of houses on the outside, as you can see right here. This is, again, very similar to von Thunen's circular pattern that he proposed in Germany in the 1800s, the mid-1800s. You have linear clustered settlements, and those are going to be along a river, a road, or a dike, and we can see right here. Oftentimes when they're found here, the common example we see is the French long lot system, where the French resided in a long lot in the St. Lawrence River in Quebec. And the median is very important because that will be where communication is. So decreasing the distance decay, or also making it very accessible to the economic markets, which are situated in the middle of these linear settlements. Here's a look at Washington, D.C. We can see that the long lot system was in place for some of the structures in Washington, D.C., where you look at linear developments along the Potomac River. The New England area is going to be a clustered rural settlement. The center will be the center of the settlement will be the church and school, which is going to be the New England way, the common culture. These are land grants, so they come across with land grants for future settlers. They had to set up for protection, so they clustered to protect themselves from Native American attacks. We see some clustering today in New England. One other factor that led them with these land grants was the cheap and an abundance of land available for their settlements. And again, here shows you the landmarks that you would see in clustered settlements. Again, establishing the common culture, the New England way. Middle colonies is a more heterogeneous group of people. So they came from all parts of England to the middle colonies, or all parts of Europe, rather. And with that, They were individuals that were not a member of a cohesive group like the New England Way. They came because of cheap land and abundance of land. So they had individual land acquisitions, and they became dispersed, much larger farms. And with larger farms, they were able to operate more efficiently on a larger scale. Here's a look at isolated farms in excuse me. Here's an isolated farm in Wisconsin. You can see that most farms in the Midwest are going to be isolated farms, not clustered rural settlements of agricultural production. All right, and looking at these two systems, we have the long lots system, which provides better transportation to the market, but also England oftentimes used property lines called meets and bounds to establish geographical grid systems. Which is better for a settlement and access to services? Here's a look again at Washington, D.C., and we can see that the tourist map shows the urban morphology, so the development of the urban areas, and the function and the zonation of cities. You can see zones of, again, following meets and bounds, so territorial boundaries, and then we also see the long lot system influencing the Potomac River. Take a moment to discuss what you've learned. In Europe during this time, they passed the Enclosure Movement Act, and that was between 1750 and 1850, and it resulted in the consolidation of individually owned strips of land. So it encouraged people to move to industrial jobs in the rapidly growing urban centers, and with that, they created more efficient farming, so hence the birth of commercial farms. So you had more efficient farming in rural areas and more people interregionally migrating from rural to urban to take on higher paying factory jobs. But this also created social stratification. Again, the distribution of wealth, or IHDI, Inequality Human Development Index. We begin to see inequalities within social status within cities. All right, looking at prehistoric settlements, here's the city of Ur. The city of Ur is going to be seen in present-day Iraq. Present-day Iraq is potentially one of the first urban settlement areas of the world. It was in the Fertile Crescent in the Southwest Asia, known as Mesopotamia. About 4,000 years ago, the city of Ur was discovered. We look at the urban settlement timeline. We see from the Fertile Crescent, which is this area here, modern-day Iraq, Tigris and Euphrates rivers. Then it diffuses to ancient Egypt. And again, when we look at the diffusion to Egypt, we have to keep in mind that there are other settlements that are happening, potentially two at the same time, like in China, as well as the Indus Valley in South Asia, or they could have been diffused. Again, this is archaeological research and some of it's disputed. All right, here is a look at 6 hearths of urbanization. As already mentioned, you have Mesopotamia dating as the oldest, according to most textbooks, diffuses to ancient Egypt, and then it could be Indus Valley, which is in modern-day Pakistan, and the Hanghe, or the Yellow River in China. And then we have Mesoamerica, and then South America. All right, large urban settlements spread across Asia and Europe and North Africa. And again, no one knows the precise sequence of events through which settlements were established to provide services. Let me go back to, let me just talk about these real quick. When we look at ancient urban settlements were first established in the Eastern Mediterranean about 2,500 before Common Era, so about 4,500 years ago. So we look at the eastern side right in here. And we can also see that along these routes, there were trade centers, like along the Aegean Sea here, and then also military protection posts from the Roman Empire. We can see also the formation of the first city-states. So the Roman city-state, Constantinople city-state. These are city-states where now you have an established settlement that provides public security and basic trading or business trading, and then also consumer services. Patronage is evident. We see this with the Roman Empire, specifically with centers of administration, military, and other public services. And then you have retail and the consumption of material goods along expansive roadways along the Roman Empire. And they also had aqueducts that provided service of water to inhabitants. In fact, when we look at Rome during this time, it was the first urban settlement to eclipse 500,000 people. And then the fall of Rome led to urbanization, settlements to decline in Europe, cast in the Dark Ages, but then the emergence of other city-states that would have been found in China, clustered in China. And clustering in China is estimated within these regions to have happened between 600 and 1500 Common Era. And then urban life won't revive until about the 11th century, where we begin to see kingdoms and feudal lords. And then with feudal lords, they're going to set up territories that are going to be composed of knights and nobles and serfs. And that will continue through the 14th century, where you have dense networks that will be established in the 14th century. And they will also power centers for the lords and church leaders and major market centers. And medieval times European urban settlements were usually surrounded by walls. So during the medieval Europe, many lacked the space for construction, for like shops and large buildings. When we look at the network of small towns, the trades, market centers, churches, surrounding walls, again, the evolution of urban settlements, we can again move through some of the we have city centers that begin to emerge, and then we see city centers that evolve into large urban settlements, and then large urban settlements will begin to see larger urban settlements that will contain business and services, and then eventually to world's most dominant cities, where we have urban settlements that have specialization in consumer, business, and public services. All right, here's a look at Xi'an, China, where the terracotta warriors guarding the emperor. Estimated there are 700,000 laborers in 200 before Common Era. So we can see the central city, or the city-state in Xi'an. So of a large urban settlement. Here's a Mayan pyramid, Chichen Itza. Chichen Itza, again, is an area where urban settlement was seen to offer public services. Public services would have been the various pagan gods like the sun. Then services like there was the ball game in the Mayans. So we begin to see business, consumer, as well as public services in Chichen Itza. Here's another look in the Indus Valley civilization of Mohenjo-Daro Again, where we begin to see clustering of consumer services and business services and public services. Take a moment to review what you've learned. All right, urbanization. What is urbanization? Urbanization is the population of urban settlements growing, which is known as urbanization. So we look at the percentage of people. The pace of urbanization is occurring quicker in the developing world than in the developed world. A greater percentage of the developed world, currently 79%, live in urban areas compared to 50% in developing world. Traditionally, we commonly associated with high urbanization with economic development, but that's changed in the 21st century. The first time we've seen more than 50% of the world's inhabitants living in urban areas was in 2008. The world on average is half urbanized. Developed countries are generally more urbanized than developing countries. That's a good video. We look at the two dimensions of urbanization, and it's important to distinguish between these two. One is the percentage of people living in urban settlements. Right here, the percentage of people living in urban settlements. And the second is the increased number of people living in urban areas. Well, we can distinguish between the two because we look at developing countries. 8 of the 10 most populated cities are in developing countries. We have the fastest number of people increasing in urban areas in developing countries. We look at the percentage of people living in urban areas. We can see that throughout history, there's been rapid development in the 1900s, so the 20th century, within developing countries. You can see in 1900, 14% lived in urban areas. Then we look at 30% in 1950s, and then by 2000s, 47%, in 2007, 50%. So you can see the rapid urbanization growth with the movement through secondary sector jobs, secondary economic based jobs, and then to the now economic service based settlements. In developed countries, we have 3/4 are urbanized, and developing is almost half. All right, let's take a look at fastest growing cities in the world. We can see megacities and primate city rules. 2030, we can see that the largest percentage of people, or the urban residents, is found in 29 metropolises city, with at least 10 million people. Transition from primary to secondary sector jobs. We see fleeing impoverished rural areas. So we see economic pull factors to these urban areas. And when we look at the poll, we can see that there's a lot of competition. Think about call centers. And there's a race to the bottom, which is a social concern that's brought up with outsourcing. Teaching rote knowledge and teaching repetitive behavior within job requirements. And then the lack of opportunities in megacities. Again, we look at the highest percentage of urban residents in developed countries are there because there's an economic structure in place, because they went through industrial revolution, and now they're economic base regions or urban centers. But when we look at less developed countries, there's a lot of people pushing away from farm work or rural areas because of the economic pull factors, but rising unemployment opportunities in manufacturing and services are not luring. They don't have the jobs, so a lot of these people are migrating without the jobs or infrastructure being in place, and this leads to slums like Cairo, like cities of the dead in Cairo, where people are living in cemeteries and graveyards. And it's also led to pollution in waterways, specifically as we learned about with water runoff. They don't have municipal runoff. They usually, all their sewage goes right into bodies of water, which creates large volumes of water pollution. which is point source pollution. Lewis Worth was a human geographer that came up with, in the 1930s, came up with different ways to classify permanent settlements. He said that an urban area has large size. How do you know that? There's relationships are usually contractual, meaning your relationships are mainly you acquiring a service and paying for that service. He also said that high population density would lead to higher, well, the bid rent theory, so more the smaller space and more expensive space would be in urban areas. And then there would be a heterogeneous group of people. There would be a heterogeneous group of people with greater freedom because you have cultural diversity, but also loneliness because of large culture or because of large population. But recently, when we look at his theory today, urbanization is too hard to define because there's several reasons why it's not true. Because if we look at urban-rural differences, the social heterogeneity is not, it's blurred. It's not as clear as it was in the 1930s. We can see that all but 1% of workers in developed societies hold urban types of jobs. So nearly universal ownership of motor vehicles, electronic devices, and other modern communication and transportation systems has also reduced the differences between urban and rural lifestyles in developed countries. So again, we see this social distinction between urban and rural life blurred today. Here is a look at urbanization has increased in both developed and developing countries, but a faster pace in developing countries. And why is it a faster pace in developing countries? Because of economic pull factors and better quality of life, but it's also created problems because they lack the infrastructure and they also don't have the jobs, so which creates slums, which we'll talk about in urbanization. All right, here's again a Korplev map that looks at the percentage living in settlements. Developing countries generally have lower percentage urban settlements, although Latin America would be an exception. We look at within developed countries, 79% live in urban areas. And then if we look at Latin America, 78% live in urban areas, almost equivalent to that of a developed country. And then when we look at the lowest percentage of lowest percentage of urban dwellers would be in sub-Saharan Africa, where there's less than 40%, and the lowest would be in South Asia, which has less than 35% of the people living in urban areas. But again, the gap is closing rapidly. But again, it's for reasons that are basically population growth, large NIR, and also interregional migration. Unlike developed countries that were urbanized because of economic pull factors, industrial jobs, and now in the 21st century, tertiary or service-based economic systems. Here's a look at urban settlements. And this we begin to see megacities. Megacities are classified by the United Nations of a city with more than 10,000 residents. And we can see megacities with purple, and we can see a lot of megacities in less developed regions. So again, megacities are mostly found in less developed regions. World megacity changes. Megacities used to be found in the 20th century in London, Paris, New York because of economic industrial pull factors, secondary jobs in the cities. But now it's different. In 2000, they're estimating by 2025, most megacities are going to be found in less developed regions, which are tropical climates. Possibly the largest migration in human histories is going to happen in some of these megacities. The largest city currently is Tokyo, but estimates say as soon as 2030, Jakarta, Indonesia could be the largest city. Again, these rapidly growing mega cities. But again, with these mega cities, it's created a lot of infrastructural and pollution problems because the jobs are not, they don't have as many jobs to fit the number of people migrating. All right, again, we can see the growth. When we look at mega cities today, only 9 are in developed countries of the 37 mega cities. So if we take 9 away from 37, then we know that there's 28 of the fastest growing cities are going to be found in less developed regions. All right. Mega cities can grow into meta cities. Meta cities are classified in your book as having more than 20 million people. When they have more than 20 million people, they can form meta cities, which links knowledge economy and transportation technology and university development in advanced economic sectors from tertiary and quaternary if they are in the semi-periphery. But if mega cities advance to meta cities that are not in the semi-periphery, then they will just continue to see the problems, but at a larger larger need and larger problem in these fast-growing mega cities. So again, meta cities that are in the semi-periphery tend to link cities. But a meta city in your textbook is any city that's greater than 20 million people. Again, well, generally, we talked about this already. Generally, more developed countries are going to be seen as having a higher urbanization rate. But now with megacities, it's changing in developing regions like East and South in Latin America. They're developing at different rates. So again, there's potential for some of those megacities to turn to metacities by combining or by linking agglomerations of transportation and business services. All right, here's another look at megacities. Again, all but 4 of the 100 fastest growing urban settlements in 2018 were in developing countries. 5 of the 13 growing at more than 4% per year were in Africa. 3 were in India. 4 were elsewhere in Asia. 1 was in Latin America. The 4 megacities in developed regions are 3 were in the United States, so Las Vegas, Austin, and Atlanta. And then South Korea with Seoul. Again, urbanization was once associated with economic development, although even though the job opportunities may not be readily available, over the other half results from high natural increase rate in Africa. So again, when we look at sub-Saharan Africa with these sprouting of mega cities, we see that 3/4 of them are just because of urban growth, the high natural increase rate, and 1/4 of them are because of interregional migration from rural primary economic sector jobs to urban secondary economic sector jobs. All right, so again, we can see the fastest growing urban settlements located in China. Again, we look at Benai, China. You see that the fastest growing urban centers is located in the southeast region of China, near the border of Vietnam. Again, Jakarta could be the next largest city as early as 2030. Here's a good video on urbanization. Okay, and then in conclusion, make sure you can answer all these questions. That'll conclude Chapter 12, Kyushu 4 notes.